Nature is a beautiful thing. It's filled with diverse organisms that fill various niches. Often, organisms live near and directly affect each other. This is an ecosystem. Today, we look at the behind the scenes of an ecosystem.
Class. Today we're going to be learning about Chapter 54, Ecosystems. An ecosystem consists of a community, including organisms and abiotic factors. An abiotic factor includes things such as light, temperature, and the air around us.
Trophic relationships. The trophic level that ultimately supports all others consists of autotrophs, also called the primary producers of the ecosystem. Most autotrophs are photosynthetic organisms that use light energy to synthesize sugars and other organic compounds, which they then use as fuel for cellular respiration and as building material for growth. Organisms in trophic levels above the primary producers are heterotrophs, which directly or indirectly depend on the photosynthetic output of primary producers. Herbivores, which eat plants and other producers, are primary consumers. Carnivores that eat herbivores are secondary consumers, and carnivores that eat other carnivores are tertiary consumers. Another important group of heterotrophs consists of the decomposers, which get their energy from non-living organic material, such as the remains of dead organisms, feces, fallen leaves, and wood. In an ecosystem, the amount of light energy converted to chemical energy by autotrophs during a given time period is called primary production. Much of primary production is not used by consumers. Now, the amount of chemical energy in consumers' food that is converted to their new energy or biomass is called the secondary production.
In an ecosystem, it is important to know that energy cannot be created or destroyed. However, it can be transformed. Energy passes on through organisms every time someone is eaten. 10% of that energy is kept, while 90% of it is lost as heat into the environment. Now, the gross primary production is the amount of light energy that is converted to chemical energy by photosynthesis per unit of time. The net primary production is equal to gross primary production minus the energy used by the primary producers by respiration. Now, what does this mean? When plants undergo photosynthesis, the energy that they take from the sun, they use some of that energy to make their own, as in cellular respiration. So we have to take that into account when we're talking about the total amount of energy available to the ecosystem. Now, this can be demonstrated by a simple equation. Net primary production is equal to gross primary production minus R, which is respiration. This equation is also correlated to the 10% rule, which states that 10% of energy is kept in the food chain every time energy is passed on from one organism to the next. The closer you are to the surface of a body of water, such as a lake or an ocean, the more amounts of photosynthetic phytoplankton you'll find. Now, as you go deeper and deeper into this body of water, less light energy is being passed through. You will see less phytoplankton because there will be less amount of light energy to make photosynthesis. To substitute this, we will find higher concentrations of nitrogen and phosphorus, and these organic molecules are what organisms will use to substitute light energy. A limiting nutrient is the element that must be added in order for production to increase in a particular area. In many lakes, phytoplankton communities that had been dominated by diatoms or green algae became dominated by cyanobacteria. This process, known as eutrophication, has a wide range of ecological impacts, including the eventual loss of all but the most tolerant fish species from the lakes. Contrast in climate can be represented by a measure called actual evapotranspiration. This is the annual amount of water transpired by plants and evaporated from a landscape. Usually measured in millimeters, actual evapotranspiration increases with the amount of precipitation in a region and the amount of solar energy available to drive evaporation and transpiration.
In an ecosystem, there is a flow of energy throughout the trophic levels. Trophic efficiency is the percentage of production transferred from one trophic level to the next. On average, 80 to 95% of energy is lost throughout each trophic level. Pyramids of production detail the loss of energy with each level of the food chain. It is shown where each level of the pyramid is another trophic level. The size of the blocks is proportional to the net production of energy. Pyramids of biomass, like pyramids of production, show each trophic level as another level of the pyramid, but instead of showing energy, it shows the total dry weight of all organisms.
The Green World Hypothesis proposes several factors that keep herbivores in check. Plants have defenses against herbivores. These defenses include spines and chemicals. Nutrients, not energy supply, usually limit herbivores. Animals need certain nutrients, such as organic nitrogen, that plants tend to supply in relatively small amounts. Abiotic factors limit herbivores. Unfavorable seasonal changes in temperature and moisture are examples of abiotic factors that can set a carrying capacity for herbivores in a particular environment far below the number that would strip vegetation there. Intraspecific competition can limit herbivore numbers. Territorial behavior and other consequences of competition may maintain herbivores' population densities below of the vegetation that they could feed. Interspecific interactions keep herbivore densities in check. The Green World Hypothesis postulates that predators, parasites, and disease are the most important factors limiting the growth of herbivore populations.
The water cycle is driven by evaporation, condensation, and precipitation. Evaporation involves water turning into water vapor by constant heat. Then the water vapor will rise into the air, and since higher altitudes are cooler than lower altitudes, the water will condense into clouds. The clouds will eventually be condensed enough so that the water vapor will turn back into liquid water. These are known as condensation. Then it falls back down onto the earth as precipitation, either snow, hail, sleet, or rain.
Part of the ecosystems you see around me are the carbon dioxide that are flowing through. You look around, you see trees, and they take light energy from the sun and carbon dioxide to convert that into glucose and oxygen for us to breathe. Another source of carbon dioxide being freed into the atmosphere are the fossil fuels that are being released from these cars. Yet another source of this are dead organisms decomposing, and those organic molecules of carbon are also being released into the atmosphere.
Nitrogen fixating bacteria converts nitrogen in the atmosphere into a usable form for organisms. Organisms also release nitrogen in their fecal matter, which is decomposed by organisms such as mushrooms. This nitrogen is either absorbed by the roots of plants to be used as a nutrient, or is denitrified and released back into the atmosphere.
The phosphorus cycle ends up splitting into two different sectors. One is more of a geologic type of phosphorus cycle, and the other is more biological. Basically, when there's rain, there's rocks near a river, and when the river just flows down into the sea, it rubs off on rocks and carries sediment with it. Sediment and rocks are the main source of phosphorus, as well as some other things. And so the runoff sediments go into the sea, and over time it does rise to the surface eventually and goes like into mountains, forms new rocks and stuff like that. And then over time, weather and other natural forces end up weathering it out and turning it back into sediment to continue that geologic cycle. There's also the biological cycle of the phosphorus cycle, where it deals more with animals and other species and just living things in general. So usually the decomposition of organisms such as consumers by fungi or bacteria will end up putting the phosphorus back into the soil, and the plants will end up taking that phosphorus, using this phosphorus in their roots and then eventually in their leaves, and then the consumers end up eating the plants, and so on and so forth. So carnivores eat the consumers, and then once it gets to the tertiary level, we see that the animal dies and transfers the phosphorus back into the soil by, again, decomposition. And also, the soil is usually connected to a river or a sea. sometimes, and it's because of that, the phosphorus can sometimes be transferred into the sea as sediments again, so that kind of connects the biological and geologic cycles of the phosphorus cycle. Various factors affect the rates of these cycles, including temperature, nutrient composition, and decomposition. These nutrients can accumulate in multiple places besides the floor, including inside the soil and in organisms.
Humans have intruded on nutrient cycles that it is no longer possible to understand any cycle without taking humans into account.
Agriculture exhausts the natural store of nutrients in an ecosystem. Nitrogen is released because of the overfarming, which increases the decomposition rate. Despite this, human activities have doubled available nitrogen through the burning of forests and increased legume cultivation. When ecosystems reach their critical load, the maximum amount of nitrogen or phosphorus in ecosystems can hold, the nutrients leak off into water, contaminating marine ecosystems.
Acid precipitation is caused by the combustion of fossil fuels. Most industrial regions were affected by acid precipitation. However, acid precipitation has been reduced due to new technologies reducing the sulfide oxide emissions from the air. Carbon emission has increased due to the increase in burning of fossil fuels. Scientists at Duke University conducted the Forest Atmosphere Carbon Transfer and Storage Experiment in 1995, also called the FACTS-I. The experiment studied how elevated CO2 or carbon dioxide influences tree growth, carbon concentration in soils, insect populations, soil moisture, the growth of plants in forest understory, and other factors over a 10-year period.
The greenhouse effect is caused by atmospheric CO2, but is necessary for keeping Earth at a habitable temperature. Increased levels of CO2 increase the greenhouse effect, causing global warming and climate change. The ozone layer protects us from harmful UV radiation, but because of pollutants, the ozone layer has been gradually thinning since 1975. One can observe an ozone hole over Antarctica, which has been increasing in size.